When it comes to street photography, getting close is a challenge many photographers face. Especially if you're new to it or you're not yet comfortable in your own skin, it can be the defining difference between good and bad photos. It's so important that every time I shoot, I'm reminded of the quote by the late Robert Capa: "If your photographs aren't good enough, you aren't close enough." When it comes to getting close, we have two main options: moving our feet or shooting with a tighter lens. And since I shoot a lot with the X100 series, I've done a lot of the former. But I had yet to experiment more with tighter lenses as a means of getting closer to my subjects, things like the 50mm and up. So I picked up the XF 50mm f2 as a means to experiment and close this gap in my photography. Here are my first impressions. General impressions. Upon first pickup, you'd get what you'd expect out of most Fujifilm lenses. A well-built lens that's nice to hold and touch. But there are a few key differences that make the 50mm unique. Let's start with size. In the X-mount lineup, you have tons of options for standard portrait lenses. Those being lenses in the 50mm focal length range, APS-C size. There's the 50mm f1.0, the 56mm f1.2, the other 56mm f1.2, and even the 60mm f2.4. And with so many lenses to choose from, it's hard to know which one is right for you. However, the key thing that makes the 50mm f2 stand out is the size. In comparison to many of these other lenses, the 50mm is tiny. It's not a pancake lens, but it's quite portable and even pocketable depending on the pockets you have, which makes it very convenient to bring around and use. This lens makes up part of the Fujicron family, along with the 23mm f2 and the 35mm f2. These are small, portable f2 aperture lenses that are affordable, high quality, and weather sealed. And while the 50mm f2 isn't as small as the 35 or 23, it's still quite reasonably sized. This is probably due to the longer focal length, which makes the nose of this lens a little bit longer. As for build quality, it's solid. This lens has a decent weight to it without being too heavy. It's about 200 grams and feels mostly metal, correct me if I'm wrong. And over the years, I've noticed that I definitely prefer metal over plastic for my lenses. It gives the lens a bit of weight to it so it doesn't feel as cheap. Which is ironic because size and weight are important to me as well, and metal is heavier, technically. So I like smaller lenses, I like a lighter setup, but I also want it to feel nice. And I think the XF 50mm is a good blend or balance between the two. The lens is also weather sealed, which is a plus. I've not yet had a chance to shoot with it in rain, but I'm sure it'll come in handy. It also has an aperture ring with clicks. Some people don't like the clicks, but I personally do. It makes changing my aperture feel a bit more tactile, and I can easily get a sense of how many adjustments I'm making. Another upside of this lens is the linear motor autofocus. It means that despite being roughly 7 years old now, it still has decent autofocus. So general impressions, I'm quite happy with the overall quality of this lens. It's about what you'd expect from a Fujifilm lens. Moving on. Use with the X Pro 3. In my more recent review of the X Pro 3, I mentioned buying this lens to help with a photography problem I was having. My problem was, shooting with the X Pro 3 felt like a slower shooting experience, not a faster one. And trying to slow down my photography to match this came with a few other problems. The main one being, I wasn't used to shooting slow, and slowing down made it harder to get close. And getting close is important for the main reasons we mentioned earlier. So the hypothesis was, the 50mm would make it easier to get close without literally having to get close. And for the most part, I was right. A tighter focal length does indeed make it easier to get close in street photography. You can shoot from a distance, you're less likely to be noticed, and you can take more time composing your shot. However, this took some time getting used to, and I wasn't prepared for the trade-offs that might come with it. Because as we know, if something has upsides, it probably has downsides as well. One such downside is, it's a bit weird to use in normal everyday scenarios. The 50mm is more of a portrait focal length, so normal everyday scenarios like going to eat or getting coffee can actually be too close, which can make it tough to take pictures of food or even your friends because you don't want to be all up in their face. So for most everyday scenarios, you're better off using something like a 23mm or a 35mm APS-C size. And after spending some time with the lens, I realized the 50 is a great lens to have in your bag, but more of a secondary option rather than a primary. It's not something you'd want to keep on your camera all the time because most of the times it's too tight. And you're better off using it when you need it rather than always having it on. Unless of course you're a portrait photographer, then your needs may differ. Another problem with this lens is it actually fed into some of my bad habits. We mentioned earlier that one particular bad habit of mine is not willing to or being hesitant to get close to my subjects in street photography. Some find this easy, I find it challenging, especially when it comes to strangers or environments that I'm not particularly used to. So although the 50mm did help to kind of get close, it also fed into this bad habit of mine, not willing to or not wanting to get close to my subjects. I no longer walked closer because I had no real incentive to get close. And in certain photo sessions where I normally force myself to take a few extra steps, I didn't, because with the tighter focal length I could just simply shoot from afar quite comfortably. Which means that after using this lens, the real problem is actually me, not the focal length I use. So as you can tell, that's been my experience with this lens. It's kind of a mixed bag. Moving on. Street photography at Coachella. In my time with this lens, I also had the chance to take photos at Coachella. These are a bunch of photos I took back in April, and it was my first real time using this lens. And thinking back on this experience and looking over these photos reconfirms many of the thoughts I had. It's great for some scenarios, but too tight for others. Especially at an event like this, it was mostly too tight. You've got massive crowds, big stages, and lots of people. And for situations like this, I prefer something wider. It was, however, quite useful for photographing artists performing on stage. Especially for an event like this, it can be tough to get to the front. Everyone wants to get close, but there's no space, it's suffocating, and you'll probably have to show up early. But again, the closer you get, the better your photos. So a tighter lens like this can help offset this problem if you're further from the stage. All in all, if you're trying to take nice concert or event photos, it really depends on what you're trying to take a picture of and where you are in the crowd. If you want to photograph the artist, a tighter lens like the 50 and up can help. But if you're looking to do more street style, like taking pictures of people in the crowd, the venue itself, and the concert experience, stick to a 23 or 35. That's my recommendation at least. An aspect of this lens that did come in handy was the size. The 50mm f2 is much smaller than many other lenses, especially ones of this focal length, so it was way easier to bring around. Plus, if I did want an even tighter focal length, it might mean a much bigger lens, which would not have been worth it. Because listen, it's like 90 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit outside, you're walking a ton, and you're already tired from an irregular sleep schedule. So the last thing I wanted to do at the time was lug around a giant lens. So the 50mm f2 is probably the best in between for this particular scenario. I've yet to use any portrait lenses that are this good, this small, and this portable. And my only other real option at the time was the 18-55. With that lens, I could shoot tight or wide if needed, but it is a bit bigger. And the variable aperture of the 18-55 was a caveat as well. With the 18-55, I shoot mainly at f4, especially on the tighter end, which makes it difficult to get good low light exposure. So the XF50mm f2 was great for this. It's not only smaller than the 18-55, but has an f2 aperture, which in my opinion is a great aperture for this focal length. Many people might want more bokeh, but personally any wider than f2 might be too much. You see, I'm not a person that needs a stupid amount of bokeh. f2 feels perfect, and there is already decent compression with this lens because of its tighter focal length. So whether or not you want more bokeh and f2 is a limiting factor for you or not, that's really up to you. In my opinion, I found f2 to be perfect for my purposes. So that's been my experience testing this lens out at an event like Coachella. Let's move on. Would I recommend it? As you could probably tell, there are many ups and downs to having this lens. It's not perfect and it's not supposed to be. Rather, there are certain aspects about this lens that make it good and certain aspects that I find limiting. The key is to understanding what those aspects are, what is important for your photography, and whether or not you can live with the downsides. If you are a new photographer just getting started, I would not recommend this lens, because its focal length is quite limiting for everyday photography and it's more situational than anything. And you're better off starting with something like a 23mm or 35 APS-C. The main exceptions would be if you want to get into portrait photography or you know you're going to need something this tight. If that's what you're primarily doing, this could be a great first option, although I still might recommend something like the 35mm because I feel like it's more versatile. Now, if you already got your standard primes and zooms and you're looking for something of this specificity, that's where this lens comes in. In my opinion, it's not going to be your primary everyday focal length, but it's a great lens to bring around and mix it up when you need to. Plus, the best part about this lens is the price. We mentioned size, build quality, and you can already tell that the image quality is quite solid. But a quick search online will find you used copies for roughly $250 to $300. And if we factor in all the other features of this lens, that's a great price. So overall, it's a pretty good lens. One that I think is worth trying out and seeing if you like it. Anyways, that's it for me. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts on this lens in the comments down below. And if you like photo books, check out my recent photography zine, The Sinking Sun. You can grab a free 4x6 print while you're at it. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye.